I've always been a fan of legal dramas. I loved LA law. You know, they're just, sometimes you can figure out what's going to happen, but they're always intense and interesting. I don't know how much like real law they are. I haven't spent a whole lot of time in courtrooms, but I like them. I love when they ask the question, your testimony is whatever. It's usually thought of as a legal statement. In fact, traditionally, in this country at least, we end it with, so help me God. Like so many things, God gets tacked on to the end of things with the belief that we will really mean it if we swear to God. Kids sometimes will do that. Under God has been added to the pledge many years after it was written. In God we trust was put on our money long after we had money and were a country. We use God to guilt people, to test their truthfulness, to limit their freedoms. That is not testimony. That is manipulation. In the church sense, testimony is something that we do to say, this is how God has moved me or been in my life, like we do during our prayer time. We ask where God has been seen. So John came to testify to the light. Now I remember it was many years ago when I was in college and I was taking a comparative religion class, and this wonderful woman, preacher, came into our class to talk about her faith. She was a Pentecostal. I had never met a Pentecostal. I was 19 years old. I grew up, in New York. We didn't really have too many of them out in public, at least. And she seemed to me to be pretty normal. I had this idea of what a Pentecostal was, having read about it, but here she was, this lovely woman. So the next Sunday, she came in preparation, because the next Sunday, we took a field trip to her church for their evening service. And it was very different from my experience of church. We barely stood up. They hardly sat down. And when it came time for testifying, there was a lot of speaking in tongues, which I had only seen as a documentary. It had a remarkable impact on me, this testifying to their faith. Because not everybody spoke in tongues, just a few, and they did it right, biblically. They testified in tongues, and then somebody stood up from somewhere and said, oh, this is what he or she said. But the testifying part of it, where we talk about the work of God in our lives, that I've done ever since I started serving churches in 1984. See, I knew these things existed. I knew that testifying was a tradition, but I didn't know people still did it. So John the Baptist, this very interesting character, especially in the Gospel of John, right? He's portrayed in many different ways in the four Gospels. But the writer of John, and again, John is written probably 60 years after all these things happened. The author of John really tries hard to diminish who John was. He makes him a stranger to Jesus, even though we know they were closely related, probably cousins. He has John say right up front that he is not the Messiah and that he's not Elijah, even though Jesus said he was. This idea of John being the Messiah isn't an issue in the other Gospels, but I guess by the time this Gospel is written, there's competing movements. Some people thought John was the Messiah. In the Gospel of John, also, unlike the others, John is seen as in competition in baptizing more people than Jesus and his disciples. It's a win-lose rather than win-win situation. John, I think, was seen as the Messiah because he fit the tradition's expectation of what a Messiah would be. John was like Old Testament prophets, and Jesus was not. Jesus comes across as more mainstream, more reasonable. John was odd. Although it is interesting if you caught it, even though we think of John baptizing out in the wilderness, it says he was in Bethany, which is very famous, of course, for Jesus going there quite often, only a few miles away from Jerusalem. The expectation in Jewish folklore was that Elijah would return before the Messiah. Because remember the story, Elijah's taken up in a whirlwind, he doesn't die. They leave a chair empty for Elijah. I have often interpreted it a little bit differently, kind of like the saying, yeah, when pigs fly. The Messiah will return when Elijah comes back, and that will never happen. But the early church took this very seriously. And that's why the book of Malachi, which in the Hebrew scriptures is in the middle, Malachi gets put at the end. Because Malachi testifies to the return of Elijah. And indeed, like I said, Jesus said, if you will believe it, John is Elijah. There was a belief, though, in many circles, that the people who were being oppressed, the people of Israel being oppressed by Rome, had been abandoned by God. God was gone. And then here comes John, only 6 months older, or 3 months actually, older. Can't do the math. Than Jesus was. Here comes John, whose mother is visited by Mary when she finds out Elizabeth is pregnant. Here comes John, dressing weirdly, eating funny stuff, shouting at people and calling them broods of vipers. Here comes John to testify to the light. Jesus came and preached about freeing the prisoners, about lifting up the brokenhearted, about bringing God's justice to an unjust world. Jesus wasn't the Messiah that the world expected. But Jesus was the Messiah the world needed. When we testify to the light, it is the light that is in our lives. It's not condemnation, it's not judgment, it's not our belief that others are living in darkness. It rather is how we have come to the light. It is how God has made our existence more meaningful. It is not a commentary on the drabness of what other people might be experiencing. Evangelism, telling the good news, is so often a condemnation of others rather than an explanation of our own joy and our own revitalization. And this is why I think so many people refuse to do it. And evangelism often fails to produce happiness and brings fear and dread. The fear of the Lord, not the love of the Lord, is the beginning of wisdom, we're told. The light, the reason I think the light is beautiful, we have light here. We have candles lit in church because it represents this light. And on Christmas Eve, we will light the Christ candle because Jesus is the light of the world coming into our world again. But so are we. When we turn the lights on, it's easier to find our way. It's easier to see, but it also exposes the truth. It keeps you from tripping over things that might be in your way. But it also shows you what needs to be done. God's light is supposed to be life-affirming and life-giving, like a garden. I love that imagery, right? Jesus uses gardening and farming a lot because the idea of things growing, bad and good together, is just the way life is. Gardens need to be tended and nurtured, and light and water need to be part of that. The light is a profoundly personal yet public faithfulness in our own lives. It is spread as if by pollinators. God's light renews and repairs that which has been broken or forgotten or mistreated. God's light is not supposed to be used to inflict damage. God's light replaces our ragged coverings with clothing of righteousness, of hope, of peace, of joy. We have been called to testify to the light, not like John did, but in our own ways, in our own voices, with our own joy, with our own journey. The light tells the truth. The light brings clarity. The light helps us find direction. The light is beautiful, but also we are the light, so we are beautiful. And because we are beautiful creations, because every person in the world can become in some way a beautiful creation and may already be, their light needs to shine like ours. We testify to the light, not to make people feel badly about themselves, but about showing them where we've been and where we might be going. You and I, this time of year especially, need to testify to the light, to the truth of Jesus, not the nonsense we see everywhere, not the sadness that we can't have some kind of Christmas parade, but to the light of Jesus Christ coming into the world, overcoming all kinds of obstacles, and still being the light of truth. Share the light with others. Let your light shine so others might see who you are as a child of God. Go in peace. Take the light with you.